Hello, class. It's crazy it's come to this, but I will be doing my lectures, I guess, for a while through YouTube. So I'll have this on YouTube for you. Well, you know it's on YouTube because you're watching it. And just keep an eye on Google Classroom as we move on for the next couple weeks, the way it sounds. Today we are starting Chapter 13 or 22 in our OpenStax textbook. It is on the respiratory system. This is kind of ironic that as we move through this time period with the coronavirus, which is a respiratory disease, that we start on the respiratory system. But we're gonna take it from here. I'm gonna do 10 slides today, and then we will move through more slides later. So let's go ahead and start today with our first slide. Name the organs forming the respiratory passageway from the nasal cavity to the alveoli of the lungs, or identify them on a diagram or model, and describe the function of each. Second objective, describe several protective mechanisms of the respiratory system. Maybe in your head, before we move on, you can think of some possible organs that you know in the respiratory system, and maybe some protective mechanisms we've talked about already. All right, the next slide is a diagram of the respiratory system. You're probably familiar with the nostrils and the nasal cavity. Some of you may be sitting there at home with your finger in your nostril. If it is, take it out right now. That's gross. The oral cavity, then it is your mouth, and then so the air is flowing from the nostrils through the nasal cavity and then into the pharynx. The pharynx you know as your throat. Air then moves down into the larynx, which houses your voice box, down to the trachea, which is also known as your windpipe, into the bronchi of the lungs, left and right, primary bronchus leading to the left and right lungs, and the diaphragm there is the muscular organ that will help you inflate or deflate your lungs. And so we will go through these organs. First, we have the nose. It is the only external part of the respiratory system. It's the only part we see, in other words. Separated from the oral cavity, which is your mouth, by the palate. And if you feel with your tongue the roof of your mouth, you can feel the hard palate toward the front, and then the soft palate is toward the back. The nasal cavity is lined with mucosa, which would be a mucous membrane. That's what's going to create your snot or your boogers, whatever you want to call them. There's hairs there and cilia, and that is all there to warm, filter, and moisten air. It warms it through obviously moving into your body and the blood. Vessels that are there with the blood can help warm the air, filters it with the hairs and the mucosa, and also moistens with the mucosa. From there, the air moves down into your pharynx, which is your throat. There are three areas to the pharynx. The nasal pharynx is what's it's connected to your nasal cavity. Then you have your oral pharynx, which is the part of the pharynx that you can see when you open your mouth. If you look in someone's throat, that's the oral pharynx. And then you have the laryngopharynx down, connected to your larynx. The throat also contains the tonsils, and we can look at the tonsils here. You can see some views. Here's a little view where you can see the tonsils, where there would be a normal tonsils on the left and the inflamed tonsils on the right. So that's what you'd be looking at if you had inflamed tonsils. Tonsils are part of the lymphatic system. They will help fight infections, and they're located in the throat to obviously help fight infections in the throat. Okay, going back to our notes then. There we have the larynx, the voice box. It is a cartilaginous structure that especially in men that have been through puberty, the testosterone, the hormone will help. That Adam's apple helps it to grow, and you can feel the larynx in your neck on the front side there. And like I said, males have a more prominent Adam's apple, which would be that larynx. It's the connection between the pharynx and the trachea. The epiglottis is there. The epiglottis is the hood over the larynx that prevents food from entering your esophagus. And we have another picture. Let's see here. We have a little video I want to show you of swallowing, and you can watch the epiglottis work in this video if I can get it.
Excuse me.
Here we go. And get to the front. There we go.
This side view of the head highlights structures involved with swallowing. That includes the tongue, teeth, epiglottis, and esophagus. The teeth grind and chop food into tiny pieces, while the glands in the mouth moisten it with saliva. Then the tongue pushes the moistened food, or bolus, to the back of the throat and down into the esophagus, which leads to the stomach. Let's watch the swallowing process again. First, the tongue pushes the food into the throat. Next, the epiglottis, a small but important flap of tissue, folds over the voice box at the top of the windpipe. This keeps food from going down the wrong way. Finally, the esophagus contracts and moves food towards the stomach. Excuse me.
All right, so in that video, you can kind of see the importance of the epiglottis and make sure food doesn't go down the wrong pipe. You've probably felt food, and if the food goes down the wrong pipe, then you're going to have to, cough, or usually you cough in that the air from coughing will force out any food that might have gotten down the wrong pipe. If worse comes to worse, you might have to have the Heimlich maneuver to have someone or yourself thrust that food out of the trachea where it's moved down to. Or hopefully it hasn't gotten that far. It's just in the larynx. If it would have gone down into that area. Also, we have the vocal cords in the larynx. It's why it's called the voice box. They would produce sounds, and later on we'll see how those work when we talk about functions at another time. And once again, it's lined with ciliated epithelium and coated mucus to help catch anything that might be moving down that we don't want in the lungs, dust, bacteria, things like that. And we have the trachea. We'll look at a picture of the trachea here in a little bit. It's known as the windpipe. It is made of cartilage and smooth muscle, and it's really just a tube. And once again, like everything else, it seems like in the respiratory system, it's lined with ciliated mucosa to try to stop debris from getting down into the lungs. Moving from the trachea, you have the bronchi. The bronchi, it's plural for bronchus. You have a right and left bronchus, and they split off the trachea and then enter each lung. That's how air gets into the lungs. And it's lined with ciliated epithelium, coated mucus also. And here's a picture where you can see the trachea. You can see both bronchus moving into the lungs, and you can see they kind of split up and branch off as they move into the lungs. The lungs are paired organs covered with pleura. Pleura is a membrane that will help decrease friction as the lungs inflate and deflate inside the chest cavity. The lungs are primary elastic tissue, passageways leading throughout the tissue, and they end in alveoli. Alveoli is plural for alveolus, and that is where respiration is actually going to happen, where the gas exchange happens. We'll look at that here in the next slide. Each lung is composed of lobes. The right has 3 lobes, the left has 2, and each has its own bronchus leading into it. And here is a diagram of the respiratory zone. This is, like I said, where respiration happens. Each primary bronchus splits into smaller and smaller branches, ending in bronchioles inside the lung tissue. Alveoli are small air sacs at the end of the bronchioles. You can see those. They look like small clusters of grapes. Each little grape is an alveolus. And the respiratory membrane, that is the fusion of the alveolus and the capillary walls of the capillaries. This is where gas exchange occurs. You can see The if you're I'll go back here. If you're looking at this would be your pulmonary artery, arterial, turning into the capillaries. They are bringing unoxygenated blood or deoxygenated blood to the lungs to become oxygenated. Remember, these are the arteries that don't carry oxygenated blood. And they give off the carbon dioxide, gather the oxygen, and then move into the pulmonary venules, turning into pulmonary veins, and taking that oxygenated blood back to the heart to be pumped to the rest of the body. So that's how respiration happens. And I do want to show you a video of lungs, because some people really don't know. They think lungs are just big balloons in their chest, but they're a little different than that. And this video is a pretty good video that kind of explains what lungs are.
Hello, I'm Ross Exton, and today we've come to Live Lab to dissect some lungs. So our lungs can be found just behind our ribs inside our chest, and they're responsible for exchanging the gases between the air and our bodies, getting rid of the carbon dioxide we don't need and taking in the oxygen that we do. So that oxygen is carried around by the blood in our bodies, which needs to be pumped by the heart. And we can find that just behind the lungs. So when you breathe in, the air passes through your nose and mouth, arriving at your throat, where you can find this thing here. This is called the voice box, or larynx. And attached, we can find two tubes heading down from it. This one here goes down towards the lungs. This is called the windpipe, or trachea. And here, we have the esophagus. Now you want your air to go down the trachea to your lungs, and your food to go through the esophagus. This is called an epiglottis. When you swallow, it closes over the top, blocking the trachea and preventing any food from going down, and so instead your food just passes in the esophagus. So now we're going to remove the voice box. So inside here, we can see a structure which pinches together. And those are the vocal cords. Now whenever you want to make a sound, all you need to do is just vibrate them. And you can feel this for yourself by placing your hand on your throat and going, ah. Now combined with your lips and your tongue, that is how you speak. So the air passes down the trachea towards the lungs, but what we can see here are some rings of cartilage. So these rings of cartilage help to keep the windpipe open, giving the air a clear passage going down to the lungs. But if you know anyone who suffers from asthma, these rings of cartilage can collapse down, preventing the air from getting a clear passage down. But if you take an inhaler, breathe in that medicine, it will open back up, meaning they can breathe properly once again. So let's cut down the trachea and see what's inside. Inside here, we can see this white foamy stuff. And this is mucus. You have mucus in your lungs too, and it helps to prevent any bits of dust and bacteria from getting into the lungs. So when we get to the bottom of the trachea, we can see that it branches off the two tubes called a bronchus. So the air passes down here, going into the lungs. So let's cut down one of these tubes. So just like the branches of a tree, these branches get smaller and smaller, becoming bronchi, and then the smallest ones are called bronchioles. And right at the end of these bronchioles are microscopic structures called air sacs, or alveoli. And the alveoli is the place where the gases exchange between your body and the air. Now we can't see these alveoli, but if we cut off part of the lungs and drop it into some water, then we should be able to see what's inside it. So we can see the lung floats on the surface of the water because of the air inside it. And if we compare this to a bit of the diaphragm, without that air in it, the muscle is far more dense, and so it sinks. So what actually happens to the lungs when it inflates? Well, to show you guys this, I have a syringe full of air. I'm going to place this into the top of one of those bronchiole tubes. And if I push down, we can see the lungs inflate.
For more insides on the outside,
Right, so that was a very good video that I think clears up some misconceptions about the lungs and what they really are. They're not balloons; they are tissue, but they are full of these little air sacs called alveoli. And hopefully, you learned a lot from this little lecture. And as we move through this chapter, you can always go back to these YouTube videos, and hopefully they'll help you out. Until next time, stay healthy and take care. God bless, guys.